Right. I think we've given people enough time to log on and log in. So we'll begin. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ryan Suto. I'm with FairVote in Government Affairs Division. And today we'll be discussing the Fair Representation Act, and this is our insiders briefing. I'll introduce each panelist, and then we will have some opening remarks, and then we'll go to questions from those who have tuned in. So starting from your right, we'll go with Mr. Christian Watkins, who's the Government Affairs Advocate for Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. In the center, we have Dave O'Brien, Policy Director for Represent Us. And right next to me, we have Deb Otis, Director of Research and Policy for FairVote. Mr. Watkins, we'll start with you. So one question is, regarding the Fair Representation Act, why do you think faith communities and other marginalized communities should take the time to understand electoral reform, and how do you feel that the Fair Representation Act can work for that?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I'm grateful to be a part of the conversation. As people of faith, we're hopeful people. Regardless of the faith tradition, all the sacred texts point us to praying and working and living towards a preferred future of common good. And we're called into better community with each other and with our divine, with the divine. And that better community is a salvation that's just not an afterlife aspiration, but it can be a present reality, right? So by doing so, we're all called to participate in our own individual and each other's liberation, for a better tomorrow, working towards the common good of making sure that everybody is equitably paid, making sure that that no one's hungry, making sure that all those policy decisions, all those policies that we work towards to make sure that families and women and children and our creation is well taken care of, are better taken care of, right? And so when we have the opportunity to participate in the political sphere, that's part of that working towards a common good. And I believe that the Fair Representation Act gives people the opportunity to actually do that, to participate fairly and equitably in the political system by voting for their elected leaders rather than one winner one elected person wins all.
Thank you so much. And Mr. O'Brien, so looking at our federal government today, why is there a need for democracy forum? And why do we need to change the way we vote? And how do you see the Fair Representation Act addressing this?
That's a great question, Ryan, and thank you for having me. So I don't think it's going to be a surprise to most of the people watching this that Congress isn't particularly popular right now. I think that if you look at congressional approving polling, it's probably the lowest it's been in decades. I know it's certainly like close to the lowest that Gallup has polled in almost the 50 years they've been doing it. And at the same time, we're starting to see things like retirements from experienced members of Congress. Ken Buck from Colorado has just recently stepped down and said that Congress is the worst now it's ever been in his nearly decade of service. And Congress isn't really doing a whole lot right now. This session has been one of the least productive legislative sessions in decades. Also, Congress is struggling to just do basic things like fund the federal government. We keep passing continuing resolutions. And so we have a situation where people aren't really happy with Congress. Congress isn't really doing its job, and most members of Congress don't even really seem to want to be there. And at the same time, the American public is looking at Congress, and often they're not really seeing themselves reflected in that. Congress is older than the American population. It's whiter, it's richer, it's much more male. And this creates a really dangerous dynamic where people have lost faith in one of our central democratic institutions. They see a world with lots of serious challenges ranging from the economy, climate change, the pandemic, all sorts of global issues. And there isn't really a lot of faith that our elected officials are up to the task. And the people who are there don't really seem to represent. And this is extremely dangerous because if you look at times when democracy has been in crisis throughout history, American and global, when you have a situation where the people feel like their democratic institutions aren't doing a good enough job to represent them, they start to turn towards alternatives to democracy. And that is the worst possible thing we could have at a situation like this. So what can we do about it? This is a complicated problem. There isn't going to be one magic solution. But there are some things we can do that'll make much more of an impact than others. And I think the Fair Representation Act is probably have like the biggest sort of single, the biggest single thing we can do to sort of make a big difference and to really get the process started to reform to have a much better democracy. Because it involves sort of like multi-winner proportional ranked choice voting. You're going to see much more representation, both demographically, but also geographically and ideologically. I mean, everyone's pretty much aware of the statistics about how uncompetitive most House of Representative elections are. Most districts are safely red or safely blue, and there's very, very few swing districts where there's competition. This has a lot of downstream impact on who gets into Congress and how Congress works. But a system like this, that would basically mean that every district is competitive to a certain degree, which meaning that Republicans will suddenly be able to get elected in Massachusetts and Manhattan. Democrats are going to be elected more in places like Oklahoma and Texas. Suddenly groups that have been traditionally underrepresented, like, rural progressives or urban conservatives, will now have their voice heard again and will really sort of change the incentives of the people who are running for office and governing to start coming together to sort of make compromises and reach an agreement, and really just do the job we've elected them to do. It's not a magic bullet. Let's be realistic here. But if you look at what's the structural cause of a lot of dysfunction we've seen, it is a lot of the negative incentives created by our current electoral system.
Thank you. Now, for our viewers, once we have some remarks from our panelists, we're going to go to questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will address them as we can. Last but not least, Deb, so what is the Fair Representation Act? And if it were passed, how would it benefit voters?
The Fair Representation Act has three main components, and by combining them into this bill, we would see a lot of benefits to our elections. The first component is multi-member congressional districts. That means instead of each district electing one person, the districts would elect multiple people each. So that means the districts would be geographically bigger so that they would have multiple members each, 3 members, 4 members, or 5 members coming from each of the districts. This means you get that better representation. We have the opportunity for multi-party democracy and multiracial democracy. Right now, when there is only one winner from each district, it doesn't matter how diverse that electorate is, how many different political ideas are within that district. Only one is being represented because they only send one person to Congress. And it's time to start broadening that. And so that's what multi-member districts do. Right now, we have 60 million Americans who are what I call locked out of representation. That means they live in a congressional district that's safe for one party, but they support the other party. So they have no meaningful chance of electing someone who is going to take their call and fight for their issues in Washington. These multi-member districts are going to solve that. FairVote drew some sample maps, and we're projecting that every multi-member district under the Fair Representation Act would elect at least one Democrat and at least one Republican. More blue districts will elect multiple Democrats, more red districts, multiple Republicans. And this also creates space for Congress people outside of the two-party system. So that's just one piece. That's the multi-member districts. The second piece is ranked choice voting. We've seen the success of ranked choice voting around the country, in a lot of cases in its single winner form to elect one person at a time. When you do it to elect multiple people in a multi-member district, it's a form of proportional representation. And so combining that multi-member district with ranked choice voting is how you get that proportionality. They work together in that way. And the third component of the Fair Representation Act is fair maps. Some states have passed independent redistricting commissions. Other states are having their maps drawn through their state legislatures. Either way, whoever is the map drawer, under the Fair Representation Act, there's a set of criteria that they'll have to follow in order to draw fair maps. And so it effectively ends the gerrymandering wars. We can stop spending so much time and so much money on this, draw fair maps and be done with it and get everyone more fair representation. And so those are the three main components that all work together to achieve the benefits.
Thank you, Deb. A good question for Mr. Watkins. You and your organization do a lot of work in the voting rights arena. How do you see the Fair Representation Act kind of work in that lens, and how do you see that support moving forward?
Well, as was already explained, just the diversity of America. I mean, Catholicism, it's not a one size fit all type faith. Much like the other Christian denominations, we have the worshipers, or the representation of those worshiping communities is diverse. Same with political ideas. So with that, it would ensure the Fair Representation Act would ensure that all people have a voice in the state houses, and on the federal on Capitol Hill as well. So yeah, it would definitely be a benefit to making sure that all voices are heard, the common good is advocated for, the shared values are elevated rather than being relegated to those who won the elections or not at all, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the audience. So we'll take a question from Karen. So why would existing members dilute their powers by accepting multi-member congressional districts? Anyone want to try that?
I could jump in on this. Well, so we already have a number of members of Congress supporting this, and I think we can grow that base of support even more in Congress. A lot of members of Congress go there because they want to pass legislation, they want to improve policy, they want to make things better for the people in their districts. And then they get there and find that they're just stymied. It's gridlock at every turn, and they can't make progress on the issues that they were elected on. So for members of Congress who do want to be able to start working on important issues, they need a way to lift that gridlock. And this is why they'll support the Fair Representation Act. For members of Congress who are not interested in Congress functioning, this might not be their cup of tea, but I think that's a very small number of Congress members.
Thank you. Next question. The legislation, this is from John. The legislation is plainly beneficial, but how do we get current members of Congress who to support it, who for the most part jealously guard their power and influence under the existing system?
I'd like to take a stab at that one. Just like you said, that yeah, there are some members of Congress that are good conscience, right? But they may be concerned, from at least from the ones that I've spoken with, like Jamie Raskin, are deeply concerned about the polarization of today's politics, right? And with that concern, I'm pretty sure there's members in both chambers that feel that exact same way. So maybe giving up a little bit of their power to make sure that the people are well taken care of, you know, by their elected officials would be, it would be a short change, but at the same time, it would be a good move to make sure that our democracy is preserved for a long term. Because right now, I see we're on the brink of something that things could go wrong. Things could go wrong with the next, if not this election, it might be the next or the next, especially with the ways that we see politicians dividing, leaning into the division. We need something better. Now is the time for radical change.
And I just like to add on to that. I think there's also a self-interested argument for members of Congress to get involved. Like, as we've talked about, like, a lot of members of Congress don't like being there. They're frustrated with the gridlock. So we're getting to the point where I think a lot of people are willing to consider any alternative than to the current system. And on top of that, we tend to think things in like of a very binary, this is good for Democrats, this is good for Republicans kind of way. There's a lot more fractures in there. So if you are a Republican from California you're going to be underrepresented under the current, under the current system. Just because the way that the maps are drawn, California elects fewer Republican members of Congress than I think there are registered Republican voters. Same thing with Democrats in Texas. So, because of that, you have the opportunity to build some interesting coalitions of people from, members of parties from states that the national party might have written off, but have seen like, oh, me and my state party can be a lot more competitive under this, and they might be willing to start, coming to an agreement with people to sort of change the system in a way that benefits them. And it just so happens that change will also benefit everyone.
Being a native Texan, I co-sign this.
Yeah.
And I will add that whenever there is a proposition that might endanger the power of elected officials, it is the job of we the people to tell them what we think our priorities are. And by working with organizations such as FairVote and such as the other organizations represented here, we can all work together to tell members of Congress, you will fare better in elections if you support this reform. We will back you if you support this reform. And so we can create the pressure necessary to create the incentives to support something such as the fair representation. Going back to some questions, I'm going to paraphrase Austin's question a little bit. And how does the Fair Representation Act work with respect to the two major parties? Does it reinforce their power? Does it dilute their power? Or is it kind of not touch that power? Who would like to take that?
Well, I can give a quick stat. We created maps for every state that under what the districts would look like under the Fair Representation Act. And our projections came out even number of seats between Republicans and Democrats, with a larger number of what we call toss-up seats. So in, say, a 5-member district, we came up with a fair number of districts where Republicans and Democrats would fill 4 of those seats. And then that 5th one could be really competitive. And so I think you end up with a nice mix in the Fair Representation Act of competition between the parties. So there's a lot of opportunity for, we're definitely going to win at least 1 seat in this district, but if we compete well and nominate strong candidates, we could get a 2nd seat here. And that's competition between the parties, also competition within the parties. On your general election ballot, you would likely see multiple Democrats and multiple Republicans, in addition to independent and third-party candidates that you could choose from. Right now, voters are limited to making that choice in primary elections. By the time we get to the general in most states, you've only got 1 option from each party. And so I think this expands the level of competition while also helping Republican and Democratic politicians put their best foot forward into the general election and connect with voters and have the chance to win multiple seats and reflect multiple branches of their own party within a single district.
I have a question. I have a follow-up question. With the states and municipalities that have already introduced or already using ranked choice voting, and how are the results of those elections? How are the results after the elections of the members of work? Do they work harder after knowing that their job is on the line because of the ranked choice voting and other ways that the Fair Representation Act implements?
We do see elected officials being more connected to voters in places that use ranked choice voting. So they know when they're running a campaign, it might not be enough to just appeal to one niche base. You might have to have broader appeal. In the Fair Representation Act, in these multi-member districts, the threshold to win a seat is lower. In a 3-member district, anyone who can get 25% support gets one of those 3 seats. This is how you create that diversity. This is how you get multiple parties. You can have multiracial representation and various issue constituencies all being represented in one district. And it means candidates will know that I need to get support from this share of voters, and they'll have to be able to take popular positions and reach out proactively and connect with voters. And so, yes, it changes how they campaign and how they behave once they're in office.
Thank you. We have a couple questions regarding the size of the House of Representatives. So I'll take moderator's privilege and just say that this bill does not address the size of the House of Representatives. We're not opposed to increasing the size of the House, and there are really great arguments that people can find from newspapers to academic articles supporting the expansion of the size of the House. But we wanted this bill to focus on how members of Congress are elected, not how many are elected. But again, not something that we're opposed to, and not something that this legislation is opposed to.
And certainly this would be an obstacle to expanding the size of the House. It might make that easier politically in some ways too.
Yeah, exactly. So this could be viewed as one step in that direction. Another we'll have to go to John's question: won't multi-member districts create an unruly Congress?
As opposed to what exactly?
Really Congress now.
Yeah. What's our baseline here?
There are 10 states that use multi-member districts in some ways. Do we see any different behavior in terms of being more unruly for the states?
I mean, I'm not aware of any research that shows that a state like one of the 10 states, which is 20% of US states, right? Or whatever my math like, are there any more or less functional or unruly? And also I would say, like, multi-member districts to some extent like this are also the norm internationally too. We're actually kind of an outlier in a lot of ways. So I don't see any reason to expect that just the fact that people are coming from, our representatives are coming from larger multi-member districts would have a negative impact on like how they perform in the House. And again, like I joked at the beginning, but like, what exactly is our baseline here right now? We have single member seats right now, and is this a ruly Congress? I think anyone who's watched the drama with, electing and kicking out and re-electing the House Speaker probably wouldn't say so.
I think this can create some opportunities for cross-partisan work in a way that don't exist right now. Imagine a Republican and a Democrat who represent the same district. They're still from separate parties. It's not all sunshine and roses, but they would at least have each other's numbers. They would have a reason to talk from time to time to work on some things that are going to be good for their district. And so I think this shared constituency helps bridge some of those gaps and maybe make things a little less unruly.
Right. Good question from Michael. What does the legislative strategy look to get this to a floor vote? Take moderator's privilege again and just say that, like I mentioned earlier, this really depends on you. We need people to knock on doors with their members of Congress to tell them that their constituents support this kind of reform, that their constituents demand this kind of reform. FairVote and other organizations are working hard on a regular basis, not only in support of the Fair Representation Act, but many other voting reforms. And so we'll continue to knock on doors. But the will of the people is really what's important to a lot of members of Congress. And so, please sign up to, help FairVote, but also help any other kind of these voting reform efforts that FairVote also supports, to really tell members of Congress that these reforms are needed to save our democracy at this moment. Any other additions?
Yeah, I mean, say that, like, it's true that like legislators are generally reluctant to change the system by which they get elected and get power, but it does happen. It's happened in US history, it's happened in other countries, and it generally happens when society reaches sort of like politics reaches a kind of inflection point where they realize that unless we make a big change, we're going to lose control, something bad's going to happen. And I don't want to sound too alarmist. There are, as Mr. Watkins says, we try to be optimistic. There are always reasons for hope, but it does seem like we're starting to head toward an inflection point, and there does seem to be enough discontent within the American public and within Congress itself that I think we're at a point where ideas that would have even like a few years ago have been considered just totally out there and dead end are starting to be considered. And this is an idea that would sort of direct things in a more productive area where I think most members of Congress would like to end up. So it's just a question of, like what Ryan said, getting them to realize that like their voters want this too, and that this would actually be in not just our best interest, but their best interest as well.
Great. We'll go to a question from Jackie. It's easy to sell single winner ranked choice voting as ensuring the winner has support from the majority of voters, but multi-member ranked choice voting is more complex. So how can we counter those questions? Who would like to do that? I feel like a very dumb question.
I can start. I think we always should start with values. You're always going to have some super nerds in the room. I've got a few here with me today who are going to want all of the details. And so we got to be ready to explain that too. But in most cases, connect on values first. We want a legislature that reflects all of us. We want freedom as voters to be able to vote for our preferred candidates without worrying that our vote's going to somehow help our least favorite candidate. And so we need to change these underlying systems if we want Congress to work better. And so starting from that point, starting from those values is, I think, how you start building this coalition. What else? What did I miss?
I think you're right. And I'd also like to just go back to like the very beginning of the question. You know, you sell on the point on the idea that like the winner has the support of most voters. That's a great idea. And that's actually something we still have with these multi-member districts. The wonderful thing about methods of proportional representation is that it guarantees that whoever, you know, the people who win seats or win power are do so in proportion to the actual support they have. So under our non-proportional system now with single winner districts, it's actually not that uncommon to get a situation where the party that wins the most votes doesn't get the most seats. That's happened in the U.S. House elections before. This actually happened pretty frequently in U.S. states. North Carolina and Wisconsin pretty regularly. You see election results where the state legislature, the control of it goes to the party that actually won fewer votes than the other party. That wouldn't happen under a system like this. So if you like that majority winner value, that's actually even more better guaranteed under a system like this.
All right. Let's see. I feel like we've already addressed some of these. So, just to address Cindy's point really quickly, are there any sweeteners in the legislation? So we've kept this legislation as short as possible. It's still quite long as legislative text goes, but one of the goals that we had was to make it as short and as understandable as possible. We really wanted the central ideas that Deb laid out to shine. So there's really kind of no there are no frills in there, and you know, no bridges to nowhere. It's just the three parts and pretty much nothing else. Eric asked if is there a bill number. It was introduced this morning, so that currently we're not sure of the bill number, but we'll be sharing that as soon as we get it. Hopefully by the end of the week, but currently not yet. Another question, how can we as private citizens help get this done? I've addressed this a little bit, but does anyone want to mention maybe how your organizations help mobilize voters on issues that you support?
Sure. Well, now that you have the information, it's your opportunity to actually dig in deeper to investigate, to find out more about the actual legislative proposal. So go to FairVote's website, or where else can they see the Fair Representation Act's text, as well as the explainers and toolkits and all that kind of stuff? Where is all that located? It's
our website, our social media, and Representative Byer is also has posted all sorts of information as well.
So you start there, and then it's each one reach one. And you know someone in your family, you know some friends that are disenfranchised with the current state of affairs and politics. You know, you get involved in conversations with them and get them active and get them excited about the legislation. Then you go. Then once you've done all of your education, you know, to become informed and engaged in the political sphere, you go contact your elected officials. Say, hey, look, we have a new proposal. We want you to get behind it because we're your constituents. And then you just snowball, just keep going like that, and find and create coalitions to go directly advocate for them in their offices, either here in DC or back at home in your home district, and just get more people on board and continue to write letters, write op-eds to be published in the in your local newspapers or what have you, and just keep creating awareness of the need for change. You know, especially in such a time as this, because right now we see the way things are going, and we've addressed that before. But there does need to be some kind of change in order to preserve our democracy and keep us adequately represented.
Yeah, I'd just like to build on that. Absolutely contact your elected officials, but also, as was mentioned, write letters to the editor, just sort of like spread the word. In order for if we want this to be inevitable, we need to make it seem possible. And if we want it to seem possible, then it just needs to be something that's people have heard of and has been discussed. This will never work if it's just sort of a niche idea that a few dedicated activists and wonks are into. If it's like a topic of discussion that everyone's talking about, or at least a lot of people, the people who are paying attention are talking about, then that makes it something that the elected officials have to pay attention to and are going to start taking seriously, right? And I think just becoming something that's sort of part of the zeitgeist and just becomes a regular question that candidates are asked, or comes up in newspaper reporting, or is just sort of a much more regular part of everyday life, is going to make it that much more achievable.
Great, thank you. I saw a couple questions about how the Fair Representation Act would work in states with smaller states with smaller numbers of representatives. I would like to address that, or shall I take it?
Sure. I mean, so there are some states out there that only elect one member of Congress. Well, it turns out you can't elect one person proportionally. So, well, in that case, then it would just be the single winner form of RCV, right? It's the way that actually the version that most people are probably familiar with. You're only electing one candidate and you're trying to see who has a majority out of that field. You don't get all the full benefits of proportional representation, of course, but it's still a big improvement on the system we have now. It's like the old joke about escalators. Even when they're broke, they're still stairs, kind of thing.
And states with up to 7 representatives could do a large single member district if they so chose. In states with 5 or fewer representatives would have to do one large multi-member district, right? And I saw another question about negative campaigning. We see this every election season. It's an even number of years, so we'll be seeing a lot of it the rest of this year if we haven't already. How does the Fair Representation Act address negative partisanship and kind of negative campaigning?
Seems like a fair vote Deb question.
Well, ranked choice voting on its own, with or without the rest of the elements of the Fair Representation Act, addresses negative campaigning because voters have the option to rank multiple candidates. And so candidates are campaigning to be that second choice and third choice if they are not a voter's top choice. And so we have anecdotes from all around the country of candidates who ran ranked choice voting campaigns, voters who have voted in these campaigns. The voters say, well, I know who my first choice is, but I'm still going to the candidate meet and greet because I'm shopping around for who I might like to rank second. And so just because voters have this option and are behaving this way, it turns down the temperature a little bit. Candidates need to ensure that they are not the one who's doing all of the mudslinging, because that will hurt their option, that'll hurt their chances for second choice preferences.
Yeah. A couple questions about parties under the Fair Representation Act. So would there be primaries, and how do candidates who are outside the party system, how would they fare under the Fair Representation Act?
Right, I'll talk a little bit about that. So if a state has primaries now and they want to keep using them, they can. So the federal law doesn't actually require states to have primaries for congressional elections. It's just that pretty much every state does. So what the Fair Representation Act would do was, if you want to continue having a primary election, which I imagine everyone would still do it, you would just do it, but you would also do it using RCV. Which means that, yeah, voters still get a chance to decide who the nominees of a party are going to be, but they're going to do it in a proportional way. And you'll still get the benefits that you see of RCV in the general election. You'll still see it in the primary election too. So the candidates who advance from the primary to the general are much better represent their party base than you would have under just a single winner take all election now. Was there another question in there?
Non-partisan
Yeah,
candidates.
sure. So you just as now you'd be able to run as an independent. Arguably, you would have a better chance under a system like this because now you don't need to win a majority of the votes or more votes than anyone else, right? You'd be able to beat whatever the threshold is. Like Deb said, maybe it's more than a quarter of a vote, maybe it's more than 16, 17% of the vote. That's much more achievable for candidates, especially ones who don't have like the benefit of a party structure to sort of build support. And also, it means that people don't have to just look at see an independent candidate and think, well, I kind of like them, but I don't want to be a spoiler. I'm going to support, I'm going to support the candidate I hate the least of the two major parties. Voters will be much more willing to take a chance and either give their first or a higher ranking to an independent candidate, or say, I'm still a Democrat or I'm still a Republican, but I like what this person has to say, so maybe I'll rank them second or third. And under the system, that could help that independent candidate. And this isn't like a magic wand to get rid of the two-party system, but it's going to open up a lot more space for candidates outside of that system.
I love this lower thresholds concept.
Yeah.
If you were part of a constituency group that represented 25% of voters in your district, well, you're 25%. You don't deserve a majority of the representation, but you absolutely deserve a seat at the table. 25% is meaningful. And so by lowering that threshold, including those voices, I think is huge.
Great. Let's go to the next question. So there's another question about candidate quality. That's there any research under a system like the FRA impact on candidate quality?
We've seen in single winner ranked choice voting. I can speak to a little bit of research on that, but this multi-winner version is a little bit understudied in the US context because it's not used in as many places yet. And so in the single winner version, ranked choice voting tends to be about neutral for incumbents. So when a current incumbent is running for re-election, their odds are good in our current system. It helps to be an incumbent. And that continues to be true for ranked choice voting. When there's an open seat, that's when you see a lot of these benefits of like a larger and more diverse candidate field and lifting up outside voices. And so in terms of candidate quality, I think it encourages candidates who can connect with a broader base of voters in order to win. This doesn't mean that every candidate will do that. It means the successful candidates will be doing that.
Yeah, I will say, so this idea of multi-winner proportional RCV isn't totally unknown in America. So I think there was a period in the 30s and 40s when New York City elected its city council using the same system. FairVote actually has a report on it on its website right now. It came out a few years ago. And back then it was sort of pitched as sort of like a good government anti-Tammany Hall corruption reform. One of the things that I sort of jumped out at me at the report when I last read it a little while ago was that it said, when it was sort of surveying how people thought of the system at the time, it said, at least anecdotally, that the people who were elected, like the members of the city council, tended to be less like just sort of like party hacks and functionaries who just sort of showed up for a paycheck, and tended to be much more often like, people who like wanted to get things done and actually treat it like, a professional career rather than like a sinecure you got because we were friends with the ward boss or something like that. So at least in that like very sort of anecdotal level, we see some signs that that's happened. Like candidate quality has increased in American elections that use this in the past.
I would like to think that just like with business practices, competition drives up quality in most cases. So I would like to think that the same would be fair. Same would be true with the ranked choice.
Yeah. Especially if you're representing the same constituents, maybe you want to be the one to, work on the bill that brings home, new project or fixes a neighborhood, for sure. Because if you don't, someone else will.
Right.
That's a great point. Another question, kind of along how we finished that conversation. I'm still having a hard time imagining how multi-member districts would work. Take, for example, a 5-seat district. Would primary elections be by party, or more like a system in Alaska or California? And how many candidates would be in the final election? And what would the breakdown be by party?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. So again, like the existence of primaries at all, that's still up to the state. You know, California and Alaska right now can decide they want to have a sort of nonpartisan blanket primary, and other states have decided they want to have a partisan nominating primary, which I think we're mostly familiar with and associated with primaries. This still lets them choose either way. The only difference would be in like, you know, if you want to have like an Alaska or California style system, you know, you're not going to have a party nomination. It's just going to be everyone running together. And that's going to narrow it down to, for a 5-seat, I forget what the formula is, but like however many candidates are going to advance. Is it twice as many, or it's yeah. So I think a 5-seat election, then just 10 candidates will advance from the primary to the general election. In a tradition, in sort of more traditional partisan nominating primary, where each party voting on its nominees, each party is going to nominate 5 candidates to go run in the general election for that 5-member district. So how many people are going to be in that one? Well, it'll just depend on how many parties qualify for the ballot and how many other independent candidates there are.
I think that transfers a lot of the competition in our elections from primaries into the general. When more people turn up, the electorate is much larger and more diverse. And right now, a lot of us see crowded fields in primary elections because we're in a safe district. And so everyone's competing to just be that party nominee. But that decision is happening in June when a lot of people are on vacation. A lot of people aren't showing up. And so letting this bigger candidate field through to November and making those votes the really meaningful ones, I think is huge.
Absolutely.
And also in American history, there's a long pattern in tradition of using extra voting steps as a way of marginalizing and disenfranchising communities. What the Fair Representation Act would do is put a lot of those important votes where all the communities show up to vote, and allowing for everyone to have that voice, as opposed to putting extra hurdles of runoffs and more primaries and runoffs or the primaries, where some people just aren't able to turn out that many times in a single year for that many elections. And so we've got some interesting questions. So if we're looking at the first anonymous attendee question, in states with fewer than 6 seats, the FRA require all the seats to be elected statewide. What would prevent these members from ignoring smaller local issues if they're representing the entire state?
Well, the threshold to win a seat is the same regardless of which group of voters you're targeting across the state. So if you're in a 5-member district, if you get 17% of the vote, you win a seat. And so if you look to the most urban area within that district, maybe you've got a large city that's part of that district, then maybe a small part of that city can get you your 17%. But then if you look towards the rural part of the state, you can get your 17% from there too. And so what we see in multi-member districts is a lot of candidates will know their lane. I mean, they'll have the issues that they care about. You know, a Republican candidate was going to be running differently from a Democratic candidate and targeting different voters. If every candidate were to say ignore the most of the state and just focus on one part of the state, then they'd be leaving all of these voters on the table for some other candidate to come and scoop them up. If you're trying to win elections, you got to find the voters who can help you win. They will be spread throughout that whole district.
Yeah, I think that's the key. Like every vote is in play. So
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to wrap your head around because it's a little bit different than what we traditionally think of right now, like in terms like very geographic terms of how representation works. But like Deb said, under a system like this, you're still going to need a constituency. And maybe that might be geographic. Maybe candidates will just focus on a corner of the state. Maybe it'll be a non-geographic constituency. Maybe it will be renters. Maybe it'll be, you know, working class. Maybe it'll be a population who, you know, aren't clustered closely enough to draw that they can have their own district, but there are enough of them on a system like this where they'd be able to elect a candidate of their choice. And of course, since candidates want to get those votes to get elected, it is now in their interest to seek those votes out, whereas otherwise they might have just been able to write them off.
You know, and I'd like to think that the diversity of those candidates across the board, like one that's advocating for the rural residents, and then another one that's going to be advocating for those that are in the urban communities, them working together would foster a better system of for representation, like which the bill aims to do. And it would also give the voters more of an incentive to get out, because what's voting turnout right now, about 40%, if that, and because of go ahead.
Yeah.
Because of voter apathy, because they feel like their votes don't matter, that kind of thing. But if we have a fairer system, more people will be involved in it. So yeah, I think it's a win-win.
For sure. Go to this question from anonymous attendee, question about the effects of vote splitting and the introduction of spoiler candidates. If two major parties don't support this approach, what would stop them from registering their own spoiler candidate and splitting the vote of the ideology?
Ranked choice voting is what prevents that. We have a big problem with spoilers in our elections. Candidates from outside of the two-party system want to run, and they should have the platform to run if they want it, be able to connect with voters on issues, but then voters feel like, not sure if it's okay to vote for one of those candidates. What if they're spoiling the vote? And this puts us in a really tough position. That's a problem with our current elections. Once you put in ranked choice voting, you've solved this spoiler issue. If a voter votes for a candidate who does not meet this threshold, is not going to get one of the seats, their vote can transfer to their second choice. And so the vote is not wasted, and the election is not spoiled. And so it creates space for these third party and independent candidates to possibly win some seats if they can get that amount of support without being a spoiler.
Yeah, so like the entire idea of a spoiler problem really comes from, is like pretty specific to winner take all elections that elect candidate, whichever candidate wins the plurality of the vote. And this gets rid of both of those things, basically.
I've worked in with a lot of communities of color who see both parties ignoring their communities or not addressing their issues in a serious way, making campaign promises and not actually following through. And these communities will often feel they want to penalize these parties for not serving their interests. But when they look at the ballot, they say, we have no one who has a chance that we could actually vote for. Under such a system as this, under the Fair Representation Act, they could put a candidate that represents their community first, whether or not that particular member candidate has a chance, and then rank everyone else after that. And candidates can know, even if they win and they look back at the data, I was a second choice for this community, I was a third choice for that community. How can I do better next time? How do I go from this community's fourth choice to their first choice in my next election? So that's how I see we address that. Great. Oh, Katie is asking, do we know how many more women would be in Congress if the FRA were enacted?
Ranked choice voting and multi-member districts are both good for increasing representation for women and people of color. Our projections of how many women might win under the FRA shows that the number could increase by 50%. We could get close to gender parity here because multi-member districts create this opportunity for more different people to be reflected. And ranked choice voting helps remove some of the barriers that women face right now, like being told, hey, don't run, you'll only hurt your own party, wait your turn. And so by lifting that barrier and welcoming these women candidates into the race, this is how we can approach gender parity.
Did you say 15 or 50?
Increase by 50%.
50%.
50. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Minneapolis City Council is all women, right?
Right.
I think St. Paul, yeah.
St. Paul, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I'll put a plug. There's an organization out there called Represent Women, who has, I think a lot of people in this room are familiar with, that does a lot of research into things like this. So check out their website if you want to learn more.
And Eric is asking, one representative per district makes it very clear who is accountable for decisions. If this changes to multiple reps per district, is it easier for a rep to ignore requests from constituents?
I don't think so. So how accountable is a representative for the decisions right now if they are in a safe seat and generally like routinely win a primary that has like low turnout? No. And actually it's, multi-member districts are pretty common throughout the US, just not in the same way. Lots of city councils are at large. We talked about the 10 states that have like multi-member districts already. This is a pretty familiar thing to a lot of people. And the thing with the thresholds is that like you still need to win that percentage of the vote, right? You can't ignore your constituency because you still need to have a constituency to get elected. And politics is competitive. If you don't pay attention to your voters, someone else is to swoop in and take them. And so you're still going to have those same incentives. But you're probably going to feel a lot even more acutely because, like we've been saying, the general election is going to be a lot more competitive under this law than it would be right now. So it's a lot harder for elected officials to become complacent.
And I saw a few questions. Sorry. So from Anna, how would House members elected in an FRA with fewer than 6 seats have time to visit the entire state? I will say that's how the Senate works, and that's also how there are a lot of at-large states like Vermont has one member of Congress. So
Wyoming's a pretty big state. Alaska's a pretty big state.
One member of Congress. Again, this does occur under the current system. Some other states would kind of join that in one larger at-large district, but yeah, when members of Senate campaign, they campaign the entire state, they represent their entire state, and members of Congress would be able to do so.
And also, like what we've talked about with the thresholds and constituencies that you're going to have to find, like you're not trying to win every single vote in the state, right? So you're going to candidates are going to figure out or decide who their constituency is. Maybe it's this geographic portion of the state. Maybe it is the rural residents of this part of the state, or like the cities in this part of the state, or with just a certain type of voter demographically, economically, something like that. So they're going to target those voters specifically. So it's going to be less a question of going everywhere and more a question of finding out where your people are and targeting them.
Gene asked me a question that's easy to answer at the bottom, and that's it's when will this take effect? It would take effect after the 2030 redistricting cycle. So we don't have to make new districts right now. We just have them. So that will take time, give everyone enough time to kind of prepare. The Fair Representation Act is a big change in our politics, but we think a big change is needed in our politics. I think we're hard pressed to find many people who feel that it is working perfectly as is. So if anyone is kind of apprehensive about the change that it would bring, we think that is a good thing. And what is the current level of support for the Fair Representation Act in Congress? And is this being tracked anywhere that we can reference? So the bill was introduced today. There's 7 co-sponsors, original co-sponsors. After today, we're hoping to obviously get more members of Congress on with your help, and it'll be on congress.gov, and we'll certainly be having regular updates on our website as well.
And there are a lot of opportunities to grow that support because there are a number of members of Congress who are potentially open to this idea, but they're not hearing that it's important to voters. And so if we want them to prioritize this, they do need to hear from some of their constituents that this should be on their agenda.
And Jeremy's asking, website specifies that excess votes above a winning threshold are counted for their next ranked choice. How do we determine which votes with an initial count are the excess and get a second count?
All right, Jeremy, great question. Let's get on the whiteboard. So yes, this version of ranked choice voting does include that. So in typical ranked choice voting, in the single winner ranked choice voting, there's this concept that if your candidate gets eliminated, then you don't want to waste your vote, so your ballot goes to count for your second choice. And so multi-winner ranked choice voting has that same concept. A vote for a trailing candidate can transfer to its next choice so that a vote's not wasted. But we add a second thing on top of it. A vote for a candidate who's already won without your support, that extra vote could be similarly wasted. And so some of those, we call that the surplus votes. If a candidate has twice as many votes as they need to win, some of those are going to move over to it's going to move over to the second choice of those voters. And that's how you ensure, say you had 2 Democrats on the ballot and there are enough Democratic voters to elect them both. But what if most voters voted for one of them and their second choice was that second Democrat? You wouldn't want one party member to essentially hog the whole base of support, because we're trying to get proportional here. And so that was kind of the explanation of why these surplus votes exist and get transferred. But I think your actual question was, how do we decide which ones? It's a fractional transfer method. This is the method that's been in use around the world. It works pretty well, but it's math. And so we think of it like, imagine your vote was $1. If you only need 90 cents to elect your first choice, 10% of your vote, then you can spend it on your second choice. And so we'd encourage you to look that up online if you want more details on the math. For most folks, I think it's enough just to know your whole vote is going to count. If you're in a position where most of your vote is not needed to help your favorite candidate, then that's when your second choice comes into play.
So we're not picking out specific votes to transfer. Absolutely. It's just a little bit of everyone's vote that's transferred.
Yep.
Keeping it proportional.
Yep. And fair.
Yeah. And for Bart is asking for single winner positions like governors and vice president. I like RCV alone as a reform. It has many unappreciated benefits for such elections, such as less polarization, and voters feel more involved since they are asked to think more deeply. Is that right? I feel like it is right.
Totally agree.
All right.
Absolutely.
Well said.
All right. Next question, Stephen. How would this impact the Electoral College vote totals?
Well, for the most part, it wouldn't.
I don't think it would.
There is the one. I mean, so we do have a couple of states that award votes based on congressional districts, Maine and Nebraska, and I think both of those states would just switch to all. They would all be one district, right? Maine's only 2 representatives, Nebraska's 3, I think. So they would have to figure out how they're doing their electoral votes. Then maybe they might decide to just elect their electoral votes proportionally or something like that. But for most states in like the vast majority of the Electoral College, it's not going to change. This is a reform. This is a congressional reform, not necessarily a presidential election reform. One thing at a time, I guess.
Yes, for sure. Jerry's asking, I'm not aware of any states having multi-member congressional districts. I thought single-member districts were mandated by federal legislation. Please clarify what states have multi-member districts today. So Jerry, you are correct. No states have multi-member districts for Congress. There are 10 states that have multi-member districts for their state legislatures in some way, one of the houses, both the houses. So currently no states have multi-member districts for Congress. But as we've mentioned, if you are going to have a proposal that empowers Republicans from Massachusetts, the Democrats from Massachusetts would not be a big fan because they're sending more Republicans to Congress than Democrats. So the only way to really make a reform like this work is to make sure it is done federally, so that you have also those Democrats from Oklahoma being represented just as much as those Republicans from Massachusetts. So we view this as a federal problem, and this is the federal solution. Neither party is going to vote to kind of undermine themselves if the other party won't do it.
And also, there's no reason why you couldn't do something like this for state legislatures, right? So if you're not sure Congress is going to do anything soon, but you want to see something done closer to home, you can start a movement in your home state to make sure your state senate or state house of representatives is elected by a system like this. Talk to FairVote or represent us or anyone here.
Great. We have time for like one more question. Let's see, what is moving on me? Yeah, moving on. What would be expected? Would you be expected to write/call all the representatives in your district if you have a request or concern, or would it be best to target just one? It's a great question. Again, my previous work, I know a lot of members of marginalized communities. If there's one representative in that district, even if a member of that community is not in his or her district, they tend to reach out to that member. And so if you're in a member with one Republican and 2 Democrats and you identify as a Republican, you might naturally gravitate toward reaching out to that Republican. And so it will be up to the voter. I know also you might agree with one representative on one issue and agree with a different representative on a different issue. And so you can reach out to one representative to talk about environmental issues or a different representative to talk about taxation. So I really think it will be up to the voter, and in line with the rest of the Fair Representation Act, it will give voters more choice and more power to interact with their members of Congress however they choose.
To kind of give a little color to that. I'm originally from Dallas, Texas. I grew up in district in Texas 30. That was formerly Congresswoman Edward H. Johnson. Now it's Jasmine Crockett. When my mother decided to move to Denton County, she moved to a Republican county, but she would still contact Congresswoman Johnson when she was allotted, when she was in office. And now she actually writes to Jasmine Crockett or writes her office. So yeah, that backs up the claim that you go where you're represented, you go where you're wanted, you go where your voice is heard and valued. So it really doesn't, so the ranked choice voting or the multi-member districts won't negate that.
Or you could just, if you want to raise hell in Congress, you can contact all of your representatives. You can make it everyone's problem, right? Like, they're not going to know who you voted for, and they're also going to want to compete for your vote. In fact, like, this is a big advantage. If you're like, right now, if you're a member of the House is like gone and there's a vacancy, or their office is just not very responsive for good, you're kind of SOL, right? Well, now you've got 3 or 4 other people you can just pick up the phone and call. We have 2 senators. We're kind of used to doing that. It's the same idea.
And there's power in numbers. So the more noise that you make with the more people that you can muster, it would cause some kind of concern, which would translate into change. So there you have it.
All right. Well, we are at time. Thank you so much to the panel. Thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone on Zoom. And again, please call your member of Congress, tell them to support the Fair Representation Act, and we hope to see you on the Hill. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.